I just like to eat Lucky Charms. See, I just got to get myself in trouble here, in my climate. But anyway, um, now that I've dug myself a hole, let's move on. Welcome to the Wokepedia podcast. The Wokepedia podcast is brought to you by Enemies Within the Church. And of course, you can find out more by going to enemieswithinthechurch.com. Once again, that's enemieswithinthechurch.com. You go over and you click on that Wokepedia tab right up there at the top, and you can find all of our articles and all kinds of other stuff there. And once again, that's at enemieswithinthechurch.com. How are you doing today, Kyle?
I'm doing really good. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to do another episode of Wokepedia. I'm excited to hopefully bring clarity to a question and also, just have some good discussion that gets people thinking about certain topics that come up this time of year: country, patriotism. How do we behave in this country, in a nation, as Christians? What are our responsibilities, and how should we prioritize them?
Right. And, I'm excited for this episode too, because we're going to be talking about primary colors, and I am really bad at matching things. So I'm hoping that I can learn some things about color. Oh, that's not what we mean by red and blue on our notes. I see. That's not really that's not what we're talking about.
That's not what we're talking about, but I feel like me and you are going to have a conversation after this one.
No, we are going to be talking about the colors red and blue just a little bit. But the question kind of comes, I guess we could pose it as, should Christians flee blue states to move to red states? Do they have to flee blue states to move to red states? Are they mandated to go to blue states and flee red states? These are kind of questions that that come up, and of course, this has really been brought to the forefront of the discussion, as Kyle said, because of the time of year, but also because of the releasing of Joel Webbin's book, which I don't even know the title of the book. I'll be honest, but it has to do
It's
with him.
Fight by Flight.
Is that the name?
Yep.
So you can tell I haven't read it, and. But also this whole backlash that's come against him, because he's saying basically that you have to leave, or you should leave at the very least, blue states and go to red states. In fact, he kind of calls you stupid if you don't flee blue states and go to red states. But there's been some back and forth on this. But before we really get into the theology on this, let's talk about some practical reasons. Would there be any practical reasons at all to flee one of these states?
Oh, so frankly, if I was not a saved person, but I was still conservative and or Republican, those are not synonyms, I would have this strategy 100%. I'd be pushing for it. I'd be advocating it, because the pragmatic reasons are very strong. And I think one of the big things to think about is, just if the goal is get people to vote red.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if this was an attitude of leave blue states, go to red states, if you just had the Republican voters from California, it's around 8 million voters as of the last election.
That's nearly three.
You had them go to.
That's nearly 3 times the amount of people that are in the state of Iowa, which is where I'm from. Just so everybody kind of understands that.
It's it would be a huge state just in and of itself. That many people. You have that many votes taken away from, deep blue California, and you have them go to red states or even swing states. They suddenly swing radically red. You'd win every presidential election for the next generation
easily,
just from California doing that.
And on that point too, Kyle, if you're going to go, because a lot of people might say, well, the elections are rigged. Okay. Like I understand where you're coming from. I don't understand Biden's jump in the middle of the night either. I think there's some really suspicious things that happened. In fact, so much so that I have really refrained from calling him president. I think I might have made a mistake once in these 3 years, but anyway, it when you look at it would make it impossible if the elections are stolen. It would make it impossible to steal the elections. You would have to do it by bullets,
Mhm.
not by ballots, in stealing it. Like
Yep.
that's
Yeah,
if you spread out those
it'd
8
be
million into
too.
swing states.
Yep, it'd be too large. It'd be too large of a gap to cross without it being blatantly obvious.
Mhm.
Even without, detailed audits, it would be so incredibly obvious because of the numbers that it couldn't happen. So again, pragmatically speaking, if you just want to get
Right.
red person in office, it is the winning strategy.
Like the
Now,
easy winning
again,
strategy.
red person does not mean conservative person.
Right.
That does not mean they are a godly person. That is a whole different thing. But if just
Mhm.
down to its root issue, red versus blue, red man win, that would win you. Again, the next generation at least.
Right. Now, I 100% agree with this entire assessment, and if it exactly what you're saying, Kyle. If you're going for the pragmatic, that's the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, our ethics as Christians are not based, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but our ethics as Christians, they're not based on pragmatism. That's one of the things that I think needs to be pointed out. There is no questioning the strategy. This strategy is as an earthly strategy goes, it's the best strategy that there possibly is, because you would probably, what you'd end up doing is you'd force the Democrats to go and say, we have to go popular vote. We have to get rid of this electoral vote kind of a thing. You would force their hand in that. That'd be the only really action of recourse that they could really have, would be to go into that. We probably don't need to dive too deep into political strategy, although I would love to do that. That'd be a fascinating, fun thing to look at. Um, but as Christians, we're not called to look at things through a pragmatic lens. We're called to look at them through the lens of God's will. What is
Mm-hmm.
God's will? And
Yep.
I think that's important to understand. So if you're coming out here and you're listening to this and you came in just convinced 100% that somebody should flee a blue state and go to a red state, that if you're in a blue state, you're dumb. If you're like Joel Webben, who would go and call you stupid from the pulpit for remaining in a blue state, if that's
Which
your view,
someone's going to get upset about that. So I want to clarify this right now.
yeah.
Uh, he did say people who stay in California are stupid from the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
He said other things, foolish, blah blah blah, other stuff. The time he said stupid from the pulpit, he was talking about a slightly different, a sort of nuanced version of it. I want to
Okay.
clarify that because someone's going to get upset because there was a clip that was pulled out of context going around. Although there's some conversation to have there as well, because even the context
Y-
presents a little bit of a discussion point, and we need to talk
Yeah.
about these discussion points.
So, so in, but I go through all this to say, if your reason is pragmatic, well, like, or if it goes with the pragmatic, that's fine. But if your sole main reason is pragmatic, then there's a problem. I, I'm personally probably a little bit more on the you should leave a blue state and go to a red state thing under a lot of circumstances. But as we're going to get into this, there's a lot of principles that I think that we just really need to look at and understand in order for you to
Mm-hmm.
make the right decision. Um, but Kyle, should we get into the biblical ideas?
Yeah, because that's really the pragmatic are useless without a biblical foundation to rest on. The
Right.
biblical foundation is going to give us 90% of the house, and then the pragmatic is going to fill in the gaps. Now, they're not gaps
Mm-hmm.
because God is giving us, not giving us the full truth. They're gaps because God gives us all the tools we need, the foundation we need to apply his truth to different circumstances, to different situations. That's where the pragmatic comes in. It's when you fill in the last pieces for the
Mhm.
specific circumstance using biblical wisdom and a biblical foundation. And we do
Right.
need to talk about the biblical, because the biblical here is the key. And the Bible gives us good arguments for flee blue state. It gives us good arguments for go to blue state. So
Mhm.
we're going to have to look at them and come to an understanding of what the principle that God is getting at is. Now, I think a good place to start, because one of the big questions that's coming up is there's so much evil going on, especially in radically blue states.
Yeah.
We're not
Like
talking about some of the
California.
mild ones. We're talking exactly. California
Yeah.
is going to be kind of the poster boy. California and New York are going to be the poster child of this.
Mhm.
Personally, I'd put Washington State in there, but that's because I came from Washington State, and I
A
think it's a
actually, I
more
mean,
radical state than most people realize.
yeah, Washington and Oregon are extremely radical, especially against biblical worldview. When you start to look at the euthanasia and things like that,
Yeah,
that like I mean, they're not passive on that. They're Oregon especially
no, they
is
get overlooked on this.
yeah.
Yeah,
That
um,
you could make some
but
arguments that those two states might be just as bad, if not worse, than California. Actually, like in some certain ways. I mean, California is terrible,
to
so
a
I'm not trying to make
degree,
it
now, yeah, we don't want to get into this, but to a degree, I
yeah
think they kind of become the testing grounds of the West Coast.
right.
Uh, Certain things are kind of put forward, seem to get put forward and passed quicker in Washington, Oregon than in
Hmm.
California. Um, and I think California kind of looks and strategizes, okay, this is how well that went there. This is kind of the things that we should do to get it to pass in this larger state. But so the question of evil, what do we
Yes.
do in response to evil, an evil state, an evil country, an evil political entity?
Right. And
Well, it, I think we should probably talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. We should talk
yes.
about Abraham and Lot.
Yeah, and I think there's no pun intended, a lot to talk about here, um, on this one, uh, because where it starts off is Lot choosing which way to go. There's the split between Abraham and Lot chooses where to go. And Lot, of course, chooses based upon the climate, the environment, the geographical location, but he doesn't consider the culture. You could say a lot of times maybe why somebody would move to California in that sense, because California, it doesn't get -30 there like it does in the states that me and Kyle live in. And it also gets 100 degrees here. I'm not sure how warm it gets out in Idaho, but do you guys get up to 100?
Yeah, we're kind of the Midwest of the Northwest. We really
Okay.
do follow everything that you guys do, but like 10% less.
Okay. Yeah. But I mean, it's that idea of like I understand because like when you're in California, yeah, yeah, nice moderate weather depending on where you're at in California. It's actually a pretty big state with a decent amount of change there. But anyway, uh, Lot
Yeah, I
makes
think
his
the
decision.
Jeffersonians would be upset with you.
Yeah, L- Lot Lot makes his decision and he goes to California essentially, right? That's what he does. He goes to San Francisco. He's like, hey, that's really nice over there. Let's go to San Francisco. People poop everywhere. Um, but that's what Lot decides to do, and it ends up bringing complete destruction. I mean, he loses family members because of this decision.
Hmm.
He loses his wife. There's incredible sin that comes into his daughters' lives, and there's all kinds of problems that come. But what is so? It's not just the choosing then of where to go. That ends up becoming the warning in Scripture, but then God told Lot to get out of Sodom,
Hmm.
to flee the blue state because of the wickedness. Uh,
Yep.
Does that seem like it's laying down a principle that if you go to a blue state in this sense, and you don't flee the blue state when there's a certain amount of wickedness and judgment coming, that there that it can be very costly. Does that sound like a solid principle there, Kyle?
Yeah, and the Bible does, it goes into just in general the principle of fleeing sin,
Hmm.
and it also goes into Lot as well, and in kind of the poor choice he made. So there is a principle there of where there is great sin, you should separate yourself from it. You should separate yourself from sin. And Lot is just a phenomenal failure in that
Right.
regards. Now
Hmm.
I can relate to Lot because yeah, I was born and raised in Western Washington. But if I could choose, and I've traveled enough,
Hmm.
both nationally and internationally, that is still the place I would choose to go if I was just choosing geography. The climate is amazing. At least the climate I like. I like the rain sometimes. Uh, and it doesn't rain there as nearly as much as people think. But it's absolutely stunning, drop dead gorgeous. Just the type of place I want to be. I would choose to go there. So if I was making it based on geography, like Lot, that's where I would go.
Hmm.
But I'm so happy to not be there anymore because of the great sin that's going on.
Right.
Now, does that mean everyone should leave there? Let's keep looking at what the Bible has to say.
Yeah, absolutely. So another example of this that we can pull another principle from would be Peter. And of course, we could also, I mean, we could look at this throughout the book of Acts. The persecution comes to Jerusalem. What happens to the early church? Well, they didn't stay in Jerusalem. They dispersed. They fled to
Mm-hmm.
safer places. So when persecution comes, there are times when it is okay to flee. So, and we're going to dive into this a little bit more specific when it comes to the idea of safety. But just to generalize it
Yeah.
here, when there's a safety concern, it seems like God is giving permission to flee the blue state. Does that sound? Did I cover that one decent?
No, that's completely true. Uh, Peter left. Now, it's all still within the Roman Empire, but that's actually a really good example because the Roman Empire was a true empire and it was made up of multiple independently governed provinces,
Mm-hmm.
all under the authority of the empire. And it really is a authoritarian reflection of a federal republic. So
Right.
it really does pretty well relate to what we have to question of, do I leave this province of the empire for another one? Do I leave this state for another one? And when Peter came up against safety at that time, it was take the safety route and leave. Now, he didn't stop ministering, but there's other people who didn't stop ministering, yet went towards Jerusalem and towards persecution.
Right.
And that would be who?
The Apostle Paul.
So the Apostle
It,
Paul did the exact opposite of Peter. Instead
right.
of going where he knew was leaving when there was persecution and danger, and he went to somewhere safer, Paul went towards, he went from, well, I mean, he's not necessarily in a red area, but he went to a blue state functionally
Right.
in the analogy we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And he went to the danger and it cost him his life
Right. It,
later
it
on, at least,
right. And
condensing
I
the
think,
timeline massively.
yeah. But we're just doing this to look at the principle here. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
principle here of, Lot. There's a danger in dwelling in sin and going towards sin. Then we go and we see Peter. There's in the apostles, there's a danger of staying in sin, and there's a reason to disperse. But then we also need to remember the apostle Paul, who went towards that danger. There's at the very least an
Hmm.
exception to this. But I think that we're going to really be able to draw some principles with this as well. Um, the next biblical one is probably Mary and Joseph, which kind of go along with this idea of protecting your children, right? Mary and Joseph,
Yeah.
that there was danger. Somebody's coming after Jesus's life, and God told them, "Go to Egypt. Go to Egypt." So, and they did. They fled the blue state.
Yep.
They fled the
Yep.
danger.
Yeah.
Um,
And that, what's kind of the key thing that was going on, that, like, what was their responsibility? What was the responsibility that they were acting upon?
so the responsibility they're acting upon was to protect their children, to protect the child.
Hmm.
That's a parent's obligation to go and to protect. So it comes down to safety, but specifically safety of children. Now, is there anything that we could relate to that in some of these radical blue states today, Kyle, of protecting children? Is there dangers for children today in radically blue states?
Oh yeah. Uh, I mean, California and Washington in particular have passed pretty aggressive laws that give them absurdly overreaching powers to take children away from parents who don't, quote, affirm them. But the dangerous thing is, you look at these laws and the structures of them and some of the wordings. One, it can be massively expanded.
Hmm.
Two, it's already way too vague.
Right,
So the powers that they've granted themselves, which, one, are completely unbiblical, that's a whole nother thing. But it's, pragmatically speaking and biblically speaking, it is wise for parents in those states to, at the minimum, be going, this is an option. Leaving is an option, even if it costs us something, even if it is difficult.
right,
We need to be open to this because our children come first.
right,
Our first ministry is to raise these children to know Christ and to keep them safe. We are not going to let the government take them away and sacrifice them to their idol of, moral sexual degeneracy.
right.
It'd be the same thing, Sam, if the government ever started doing forced abortions.
Hmm. Absolutely.
That's a pretty legitimate reason to take your wife and go, we are leaving here.
Hmm.
Because if they find out you're pregnant, there is a chance that they will kill our child.
Right. Now, on the other side,
Legitimate safety concern.
yeah. So speaking of that, though, you do then think of Moses and his parents, who they did stay. Now, I don't know how much of an opportunity they had to leave. That's one of the things I think that needs to be understood as well, as that
Mm.
is that there are times when people stay within the danger, stay within the thing, but they didn't have much of an opportunity. You could look at, you know, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You could, look at all of the captivity. They didn't have a choice in those things, but I don't think that they were sinning
Hmm.
at all for being there. And so
No.
these are important principles to understand and to realize. Another one that we kind of touched on just a little bit here when looking at the apostles, some dispersed, and then you have the apostle Paul who went towards the danger. There is this idea of personal calling. Where has God called you to be within your
Hmm.
ministry? And I think that's a really big key to all of this. I don't think that we can just go and say one principle and it's a one size fits all shoe kind of a thing. It just doesn't work that
Yeah.
way. When you find a one
No,
size fits all shoe, I mean, I think this is important. This is it's really not that important, but when you find a one size fit all shoe, the only one that is like that is a clown shoe.
I
Yeah,
knew
I'm
that
just
was where it was
saying. Yeah,
going,
yeah, yeah.
but it really is true. It really is
Yeah.
true. You have to sacrifice clarity when you try and make a overly specific principle. Now, I
Right.
think what we're seeing here is that there's multiple principles at play. And
Yes.
I'd say, now tell me if you agree with this. The two biggest we're talking about is there is general principles such as parents, you prioritize your children and taking
Mhm.
care of and raising and ministering to them. And there is, so the general principles that we need to keep in mind. And then there are the personal callings.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't matter what the general principles are. If God says go, you go. If God says stay, you stay. You
Right.
follow him. You're submissive to him before any of the general principles take effect, because it's all coming from who? It's all coming from God.
Right.
Now,
It
is there a way we can make this clearer?
Yeah, I think we've got a list of priorities that we can give people that would really help, and these are ranked in the ways that we really see them throughout the
Hmm.
Bible. And the first one is the one that you were just talking about, Kyle. This is the number one priority is submission to God. When God calls you to do
Yep.
something and you're truly called to go do it, you do that thing. That has to be the number one thing, especially when it comes to moving.
Yep.
You need to be where God wants you to be. There's no place safer to be than inside the will of God.
That is very true. And it's almost always going to be a sacrifice of something else.
Right.
And it's going to frustrate you. There's always going to be this temptation of, I could have something more in my job, in
Mhm.
my safety, in my whatever it is, if I went where I wanted to go. But I can't do that because God has something for me to do here.
Right.
Now, you need to be clear on that, not vague. Because if it
Mhm.
is vague, oh boy, you will likely be making compromises.
Right.
Unambiguously, I have I have prayed, studied the word, submitted myself to God, submitted myself to godly leaders that God has put in my life. I've sought every avenue I can to make sure that I am living in God's will
Mhm.
and that I'm not seeking my own desires.
Right.
That is the first place to start.
Yep.
Because guess what? All the other priorities, God can override.
Yes. Yes. And that kind of leads us to the second priority, though, because the second priority would be safety, which is something that God can override. Like I mentioned before, the safest place to be is inside the will of God, and so that's how He would override that. But there
Hmm.
are places that are more naturally or less naturally safe, and you want to be you want to be going to a place that is safe for your family specifically, for those who are under your care that you're taking care of. This is why God called Mary and Joseph to take Jesus down to Egypt. This is why the apostles, when the persecutions came in Jerusalem, dispersed. We see these principles here. Now, God did override this, obviously, with somebody like Paul. Um,
Hmm.
and s- Safety is important, especially when you're looking in the United States when it comes to this idea of your children. That's probably the biggest place when it
Yeah.
comes to safety that you need to look at.
Yeah. I think a lot of things right now, if you're single, if your parents, you're a couple, I said parents, if you're a married couple that can't have kids and adoption is, for whatever reason, you're not adopting.
Hmm.
I hope it be strong biblical reasons. God's called you to a specific ministry and you're following faithfully in that. Those type of people that don't have the responsibility of children, I think safety is suddenly becomes a much, much, much lower thing in a
Hmm.
blue state right now, because like Washington State, I don't see a huge reason why an adult who does not have children for safety's sake should leave that state. But then when it switches to children, I think the general
Right.
principle you've already hit the threshold of, for safety's sake, you probably should leave that state. You need to be seeking the will of God. Now, there's one caveat I'll leave here of something to think about. And these are mainly things to pray and seek God's will about, which is, as an example, say you are, and yes, Mom, I know you watch this, I know you listen to this, and yes, this is going to apply to you. So this is something to think about. But if you are a grandparent, you no longer have the kids in the house. So yeah, that's not a concern. But it might be time to think about, as an example to my children, I'm going to encourage them to leave because there are serious dangers coming against my grandchildren. And so I'm going to leave as the example. I'm going to set the pattern. That's something to pray about. But again, that's seeking God's will. It's submission to Him. It's not something you should go out and do. It's not something you should not do.
Right.
Submit to God.
Right. And so we have this idea of submission to God, we've got safety, and then we have the third one, which is church. But this has a lot to do with that submission to God and personal calling as well. So a lot of the debate that's
Mm-hmm.
that's happening on Twitter, at least to the main players that are going on debating about this, it's a lot of people who are called to vocational full time ministry. They're pastors, they're evangelists, they're missionaries, they're
Mm-hmm.
church planters, they're all of these things, and they're going and they're talking about this in such a way. And sometimes you can actually see, well, hey, God's clearly called that person to that place, and yet they're trying to turn their own personal calling into a principle on other people's lives. That doesn't work because God doesn't
Yes.
call everybody to the same thing. But one thing we do know, God has called everybody to be inside of a solid biblical church.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he's called you to do. And so,
Yep.
one of the things that I would say is absolutely vital is that wherever you look to live, wherever you're going to live, it needs to have a high priority. In fact, I would say more than a high priority, but a high priority of a church. Like, don't move to a place without knowing for sure that there's a good church there, unless you're being called to go plant the
Yes.
good church. But
Yeah.
you
Missions
you get
work. Mission
yeah.
works. It still falls under the category of church.
Yes.
It's the work
Yeah.
of the church.
Right. Now you have an example for this, Kyle, that you gave. You said something. It's that you said before, and we're talking ahead of time. Where if somebody was offered two job opportunities, do you want to tell everybody this? Because I think this is important, just to put it in real simple
Mm.
terms.
So the next priority to think about is job. Now, to put these two in relation, to put church and job in relation, if you were offered a job in one place and you can only find crummy churches there, but you're offered $20,000 a year more than the competing offer, but the competing offer happens to be in a city that you've found, you've researched, you've called, maybe you've even visited, and it has a wonderful, solid church. Well, again, barring intervention by God, the general principle, that church is where you need to go. You're going there for the church. The job is secondary because the church is more important than that job, especially in this country where we live with excess. The second you're born here, you're born
Hmm.
into excess.
That's right.
Money is not going to be a dramatic issue. Again, there are always exceptions to every rule, but the general thing is, if the question is, can I get two cars or three cars? Can I get a nicer car or a used car? Then you're in the category where you need to put the church first when you're picking that
Hmm.
job, because that's what's really going to minister to you. It's going to take care of you. In fact, if you're having financial struggles, A solid church is going to be a better place to live than a weak
Yeah,
church,
that's for sure.
because you're not going to be able to do it on your own. That job that pays really well might blow up the next day. You
Hmm.
don't know. But if you're in a place with a solid church and they're taking care of one another, that is so much more powerful than trying to take control of your finances in your own power.
Exactly. Exactly. Excuse me. That leads us to our last principle. And this is an interesting one because it's the one that Lot chose, and he put that as the one at the highest priority, and that's geography. You,
Yep.
I don't want to say that geography isn't something that should come to your mind. So we go over these principles here and we look at, okay, submission to God. So let's just say God doesn't have a specific calling where he's sitting here and you don't have the specific burden saying, I have to go to this place. Okay. So that's not there. God is giving you some liberty to make some choices. I know Calvinists, I just lost you on that one, but bear with me. Um, and I'm getting myself in all kinds of trouble in this podcast. The next thing here is safety. Okay, so you got two places that are safe. We look at this here. There's no danger. Doesn't violate that. Both places have really good, solid churches, and they both have good, solid jobs for you that you're going to be able to provide for your family. One happens to be, a tropical island that is just beautiful and awesome and nice, and the other one happens to be Texas. You're probably going to choose the tropical island one. I don't know. Maybe you like Texas. I couldn't think of a bad thing
Tropical
because
island, the second I hear that, all I hear is humidity. So
yeah,
I would choose,
Texas. Yeah,
well, as long as it's not the Gulf Coast. No, humid.
yeah. So,
Humidity is
so
my
my problem
enemy.
was I got started on this and then I realized like I'd much prefer Alaska to to a tropical island, and I'm like, I don't know where to go from this because I
Yeah,
totally
same
put
here.
myself in a terrible box. So, and yeah, because I'm like, my preferred climate is Ireland. That's my preferred climate, which is actually I think really similar to Western Washington. It's rainy, more mild in temperature. That we probably actually have a very similar preferred climate there. I just like to eat Lucky Charms. See, I just got to get myself in trouble here, in my climate. But anyway, um, now that I've dug myself a hole, let's move on. No,
Well, it
is there
was
anything else that we
geography.
need to say about geography?
No, I, I I mean, geography can be more than simply just the landscape itself.
Yeah.
Geography comes into the cities,
Well, it could
the
be around
layout of
family.
things. Yeah. So it really covers just location in general. I mean, political geography factors into that as well. I mean, we're talking about
Yeah,
political geography,
yeah, that's true.
state borders.
Hmm.
So
Who
it's
wants to live
important
near
to keep
Missouri?
in
Whew.
mind.
Okay, I'll stop getting myself in trouble now. Probably not.
I I'm not going to make all my Missouri jokes. Uh, although I hear that's I hear you guys have a lot of lawyers where you are, and that's why you have the Missouri River flowing through your city.
Yeah. Kyle, it's actually been stated that if you take the bottom 10 miles of Iowa and you cut that off and you put it into Missouri, you actually double the IQ of both states. Um, so now I have both offended
Oh,
Missourians and Southern Iowans, but
it's fun to hear the different bickerings between different states.
yeah. So
Uh,
since I live so near Nebraska, I gotta just make fun of Missouri now. It used to just be Nebraska for me, but anyway,
whatever. You guys are all just flat, nothing plains. You guys think a mountain is a tiny little hill. A
well,
mole digs a hole, and you think that was a new mountain that was just created.
well, It's funny you mentioned that, Kyle, because we went. So I recently, about a year ago, moved over here to Western Iowa, and there are hills in Western Iowa where we are now. There were no hills where I was at before, so we would go out Christmas light
There,
looking.
there are what you call hills.
Yeah. But we went out Christmas light looking, and we just have our car with front wheel drive, and it had been snowing. Beautiful. Go look at the Christmas lights. That point in time, and we get halfway up the hill, and all of a sudden the car just can't go up. And I was like, well, I guess got to put it in reverse. It won't go up this hill. It, that didn't happen where I was at before in Iowa. And you're looking at these hills, and you're going, those aren't hills. So it's all about perspective,
Want to know
you know.
want to know a fun fact? I'm not in an elevated place at all. I mean, I look out and I can see tall mountains that are thousands of feet taller than where I'm at.
Yep.
On out on these rolling hills where I am. I am 600 feet higher in elevation than any point in Iowa.
Yeah. Yes. And do you know why, Kyle?
You're
Just remember, low, I'm with you always. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, we better move off of geography here, because I think I have maxed out my limit of dad jokes in this.
we're just getting started, but let's move on.
So some important things to keep in mind when we're talking about political geography. How's that for a segue? When we're talking about political geography, red does not equal conservative. And conservative doesn't equal biblical Christian either. So that doesn't mean that a red state is necessarily a good state. And I think that's important, because we're looking at this discussion, and just because a state is red doesn't mean that it's going to be safe. Just because a state is red doesn't mean that it's going to be conservative, and doesn't mean that it's going to be biblical Christian either.
Because I mean, Iowa is a deeply red state, but
yeah,
it seems like a lot of times you guys behave purple.
Yeah. And I think this is a really good example of this. I mean, Iowa, this last election, went as red as anybody, maybe except for Florida. You look at that, like Florida went super red. And yet, abortion is still legal in Iowa. They literally, Planned Parenthood ships people to Iowa to murder their babies, because other states have banned or restricted abortion to such a way that they're like, oh, well, you can still kill them at that point in time in Iowa, so we'll send them there. Iowa refuses to address any kind of marriage issue, even though the biggest political victory in Iowa was kicking out 3 Supreme Court justices, first and only time that that a Supreme Court justice hasn't been retained in Iowa, was over that issue, and yet there's a refusal to do it, to go and to address those things. I mean, just because we're red, we voted Republican. All of our congressional and national representatives, so both our senators and all 4 of our representatives, they're all Republicans in Iowa. When you go and you look at our state house, it's has a super majority of Republicans. All of our Supreme Court justices in Iowa, state Supreme Court justices, are Republican appointed, and our governor's Republican, and our Senate is majority, nearly super majority Republican. I mean, it doesn't get any more red than that. And yet here we are, very purple.
Yeah. And
sorry, I just had to vent on that a little bit.
Well, yeah. Well, it's a frustrating thing, because anyway, but that's a whole kind of state level issues. But like where I am, Idaho, super, super, super deeply red state, and the city I'm in is nicknamed Idaho's liberal city. So even when you go to a red state, that doesn't mean you're necessarily even in a red area.
Right.
Now, the demographics here are fascinating and bizarre, and you don't have to go far to see a radical shift. I mean, I can drive 45 minutes south and I'll find a place that's redder than any other place you can find in the country. But but it is important. People kind of say that like it's a cliche. Like, oh, it's not perfect everywhere. But it is important to keep that in mind is don't equate red with good.
Right.
Don't equate well, another thing is like I can go to the south and I can go, my goodness, these people are so polite
Mhm.
compared to up here. Makes me feel like a rude, bumbling idiot. But I shouldn't equate polite with moral or biblical.
Right.
That does not
It
mean that that person is a moral or biblical person or that that specific part of the South is a good area. It could have tons of problems. And it is important to remember that and remember that. What is the real problem? It's not the problem is not blue states. The problem is that mankind is fallen and in rebellion
Mhm.
against God, and wherever there are people, there will be
Yes.
sin until the very end.
That's
And it doesn't
right.
matter what you do, people will always rebel. It doesn't matter how perfect you raise your kids, there are going to be kids that grow up and then rebel against what they know, the truth that they know, and walk away from God. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
So sin is going to happen everywhere. We are here fighting against it. We are here preaching the gospel. We are here resisting tyrants. We are here promoting the good.
Right. And I think that is something that's very important to remember. And it's important to remember because I've seen this on both sides. One is this idea of like equating,
Mm-hmm.
okay, it's red, it's going to be good. Uh, and that's a problem. But then also, those who are adamant about going to the blue, they might go and say, well, what you're anti Great Commission by trying to flee the blue to go to the red. Well, that would be under the presumption that everybody in a red state is saved. That would, I mean, that would be under quite the wrong presumption there. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but let's look at some of the whatabouts here. Because I mean, Kyle, Jesus went to sinners, don't you know?
Don't you know? Uh,
Had to give a shout out to
yeah.
my, Minnesota friends.
I, what's your point? So Jesus went to sinners. One, he didn't leave them in their sin. He told them to repent. But
Jesus
beyond
went
that,
to a
are
blue
you know
state.
what? Blue state, red state doesn't matter. He found sinners and he called them to repent wherever they were.
Right.
Blue collar working area, a quote red area versus a blue area. He went both in the political geography of his time, and he called people to repent. And again, what you already mentioned about red states, are they not sinners? I mean, my goodness, because I'm on the border between Washington. Well, actually, better example, I can go climb a mountain next to me, and I can look and see Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Montana. And we're not talking like
That's
climbing the
pretty
mountain.
cool.
I mean, it's just day hike. Yeah, it is really cool. Uh, all three of those states do not have dissimilar numbers of professing Christians, statistically speaking. Now, the numbers are different. The differences are significant and worth noting, but statistically speaking, they're not dramatically different. Yet, those four states really couldn't be about as different from each other as you can get.
Yeah.
So, the point is, there are just as much sinners here in Idaho as you cross the border into Washington or down to Oregon or in Montana. There's as much need in any of these states. The
Right.
other problem is whatever Jesus did, that's not the only thing. And there are other biblical examples. We've already talked about some of them.
Yeah.
We need to take those into mind because Who's the one that wrote the Bible? It's Jesus. What he did on earth is not more important than what he decided should be included in the rest of his word.
Right.
It's all important. But beyond that, we look at the clear instructions first over the examples, because the examples describe what happened, but the clear instructions are exactly that. They're clear instructions. Now, we don't necessarily have
Hmm.
clear instructions on go leave blue state, but we've already looked at those principles. And we didn't
Right.
need to do a theological deep dive. We could give you a much more theological deep dive. But looking at examples, drawing principles, kind of referencing some of the more stated commands, you get a picture of what's going on. And Jesus' example fits into that. It's not in contrast to that. It supports the purpose of the church. It supports these other examples. It supports these principles.
Right.
So what that Jesus went to where sinners were at?
Right. And I think that's an important thing, because sometimes it seems like people just throw this out there. Well, Jesus did this, so well, but that doesn't mean that we should be necessarily going and doing that, going to a blue state, or something like that, in looking at that, and specifically because the idea is the purpose is he went to sinners. Well, there's sinners everywhere. Um,
Beyond that, probably the last thing quickly to say about that, what was he doing? He was doing the will of his Father in heaven.
right.
He was
It
doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He was called to be doing.
right.
Again,
For the
submit to
Yeah.
God first.
Right. And for those of you who are actually struggling with this, maybe you're trying to decide, maybe you're in a blue state looking, do I need to move to a red state? Maybe you're in a red state and you're saying, hey, should I move to a blue state? I just really want to go back over those principles really quick, because I think this is really the bread and butter as to how you can make your decision, how you can find good counsel here. And that is one, just as Kyle just said, submission to God. Is God calling you to do something specific? You need to make sure you're in submission to the will of God. The second thing is safety. Once again, God's will or submission to God can override that, but you need to go and consider that. That needs to be a first consideration. The next thing is church. Do you have a good church? We know God has called you. We know the will of God on this for your life is for you to be in a good church. If you're in an area where there's not a good church, you should move. I've had this conversation with a ton of people. People get mad about this. They get really defensive about this. But look, you need to go to a good church. I don't know. I don't know why that's. I have people who complain all the time on Facebook. They're I can't find a good church. Can't find a good church. Where do you live? Maybe you should move. Well, I can't move. Why? Well, because ultimately it comes down to you got a job. I've had too many arguments to know. I know where this goes. You
Yep.
got a job. You love money, and the love of money is the root of all evil. It's going and it's rooting you in the wrong spot. You need to go and get rid of that. Go find a good church, and you still need to provide for your family. But you don't necessarily need to be making an insane amount of money to provide for your family. Maybe you just need a change in your lifestyle in order to provide for your family. But we see here that brings us to the next one. That is job. You do need to provide for your family. That's something important to consider. And then the last one is geography. You should consider some things about geography. All right, Kyle. So now that we've seen these five principles here, do you want to go over what the role of government is? Because I think that really does relate.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, we should probably at some point talk about just biblical government in general.
Yeah.
What does the Bible have to say about government? What does the Bible have to say to countries? Kind of how we relate to them. But let's quickly. Why did God institute human government? So God instituted human government to protect the God-given rights of man and to punish those who violate the rights of others. Again, God-given rights, not made-up rights. The authority to do so comes from God, the only one who has the authority to judge the wicked. And he has delegated a portion of that responsibility to human government for the good of mankind. Human government is not God, nor is it a type of God. And when it violates the rights of men, it makes itself illegitimate. Again, it is not God, it is not infallible. It is only wielding a piece of his authority. It is not in itself an authority to look to. And when it loses that God given authority, it is to be resisted.
Mhm.
It is to be opposed, not anarchy, not to tear it down, but to prop up government that is legitimate.
Absolutely. I think that's really a good summarization of that. We should do a podcast episode on that. I think that'd be really fun to go into break down all those things, but I think that's a really,
Mm-hmm.
really good summary um, of that. And of course, that brings us to the next logical question. And this is where we'll wrap up. And that is, what is our
Yeah.
responsibility to our country? And I think this is important to understand because that's really where the foundational question came from. Is should you leave a blue state to go to a red state because you're caring about your country, right? It was about that pragmatism,
Mm-hmm.
is where it started off. And I mean, there's a few different things. The first one that comes to my mind right away is render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. And when we look at the principles that we've cited already, your safety and the safety of your child, well, those don't belong to Caesar at all. Your child
Mm-hmm.
doesn't belong to Caesar, and so that might be a reason why you move. What's another obligation or
Yep.
responsibility we have to government?
Well, I just want to say quickly on the rendering to
Yeah,
Caesar's part. Caesar said the Roman Empire said, say Caesar is Lord. The Christians said Jesus is Lord.
that's right.
That was not something that Caesar was owed. Now, Jeremiah 29 has a famous verse in there that is, there's a principle that's true in it, but the verse itself is often abused.
Yeah,
So I want to make sure that you understand who that chapter is referring to. But Jeremiah 29:7, it still has a very important principle for us to look at when it comes to government, which is, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. Yes, our ultimate allegiance, our ultimate nationality is found in the kingdom of God. But we are here as exiles in this country, in this world, for a mission, for a purpose, and we're to take care of where we're at. We're to be good citizens. We're to render to Caesar what is Caesar's. We're to seek the welfare, the good of the city, of the entity, of the state that we are in. Wherever you find yourself, you're responsible for taking care of it.
absolutely, absolutely. And that third principle that we have here is First Peter 2 chapter verses 13 and 14. It says this: be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. And really the final principle and responsibility is that we are to submit to legitimate, righteous governments that are going and rewarding the good
Mm-hmm.
and punishing the evil. If they're not doing those two things,
Yep.
it negates that idea of submitting to them. At least in
Yeah.
those areas and in those subjects. When the when the Christians, when the early church was getting this, the question that was on their mind was not, do I need to obey the civil government, without any restraint, just obey them 100%. That wasn't the question. The question was, because Christ is our king, because Christ is Lord, do we need to obey the Roman government at all? And there is an answer here, and the answer is yes, when they are rewarding what is biblically good and when they're punishing what is biblically evil. And so we go and we look at all this,
Mm-hmm.
and I just want you to know that if you decide to move to Iowa, I can help you find a place to live. So I had to get the shameless plug in there somehow there, Kyle. I had to.
Oh my goodness.
Anything else we need to say before
No,
we
but I
sign
think these
off?
are some. I think we pretty much covered it. Again, get your priorities. This question is really easy to answer when you have your priorities straight, when you understand that God calls different people at different times to different missions,
Mm-hmm.
and that there is not a hard, fast rule. There are principles. These principles are in submission to the Lord. When you put yourself into submission to the Lord, the principles will suddenly become very easy to navigate. But you need to do that from the framework of what is government's role? What is government's authority? What is the purpose of it? And how do we relate to it? Put the puzzle pieces into place, and it's not that hard. The problem is people far too often try and overcomplicate them. Now, one of the reasons I suggested this as an episode we should do was not simply because it was a hot button internet issue. It's because it's something that I've had a strong opinion about both in the past and currently. And so it's something that I cared about. It's something that I
Yeah,
think is really important for us thinking about moving forward as this country is going down a unfortunate path.
that's right. That's right. Well, if you enjoyed what you heard today, go ahead and send us an email over at contactwokepedia@gmail.com. Once again, it's contactwokepedia@gmail.com. And if you don't like what you heard today, well, you can send an email as well. But thank you for listening today. And remember, keep standing for the truth.
And don't go woke.